It was December of 2004. I don't remember the exact date, but it was before Christmas. We had just a trace of snow on the ground, and the temperature had dropped hard that night. Sometime after midnight, I'm laying in bed and I keep hearing this sound. Thunk, thunk, every 15-20 seconds. My dog was hitting the end of his chain. He'd never done that, not once in his life. So I pull on pants and a shirt, grab my coat, grab my .45 and a spotlight, and I go out there. Soon as I step off the porch, I can see him pacing. Head down, tail down, hackles straight up. Just pacing back and forth at the end of that chain. Something was wrong, and he knew it before I did. I kicked down the spotlight and swept it toward the back tree line, maybe 60 yards out, and I saw two eyes looking back at me. But they were wrong. They were too high. 7, maybe 8 feet off the ground, and behind those eyes there was a shape. Broad shoulders, upright, standing on 2 legs like a man, but it was not a man. It didn't flinch when the light hit it. It didn't run. It just stood there and watched me the way you'd watch an ant on your kitchen counter. Then it turned, slow and deliberate, and walked into those trees the way a person walks into a room, on 2 legs. I stood there with the gun in my hand and realized I never even touched the trigger. Not because I forgot, because something in me knew it wouldn't matter.
That man has lived on the same piece of land in eastern Kentucky for his entire life. His property sits at the edge of Perry County, right where the hollows deepen and the ridgelines climb toward the boundary of Daniel Boone National Forest. That forest stretches over 700,000 acres across 21 counties in Kentucky, and it contains some of the densest, most remote wilderness left anywhere in the eastern United States. Old strip mine sites dot the surrounding hills, abandoned decades ago and slowly being swallowed back by the forest. The nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile down a gravel road that doesn't have a name on most maps. He kept what he saw that night to himself for 20 years. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't tell his neighbors. He didn't file a report with the Perry County Sheriff's Office or the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. He sat at his kitchen table with the gun in his lap until the sun came up. And then he went about his day like nothing happened. And then, years later, his grandson saw the same thing on the same property without ever being told what his grandfather had witnessed. 15 miles from that land, in February of 2020, a 13-year-old boy named Corey Godsey was found dead on a mountainside in the Emelina community of Knott County. Kentucky State Police called it a canine-type animal attack. They couldn't identify the animal for 6 months. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks.
I've seen just about everything you can see in terms of trauma and injury and people at their worst. I'm not a man who scares easy. I've lived in this town my whole life. My family's been on this land going back to my great-grandfather. Other than the trains coming through, it's a quiet place. Real quiet. I figured if I don't say it while I can, it dies with me. And somebody needs to know what's out here.
I want to take a second here because I think the context matters. This is not a guy who went looking for attention. He's a retired medical professional with 36 years of clinical experience. He's worked trauma. He's worked emergency response. He spent his career making observations under pressure and documenting what he saw. He has no reason to fabricate anything. He has no book deal. He has no YouTube channel. He reached out because he wanted it on record before he couldn't tell it anymore. That matters to me, as someone who runs trail stories and has spent years now digging into these encounters. I've learned to pay attention to who's talking and why they're talking. The ones who come forward reluctantly, the ones who waited years or decades, the ones who have nothing to gain, those are the ones I trust. The property itself is worth understanding because the geography is everything in cases like this. Eastern Kentucky is not flat farmland. It's a maze of narrow hollows cut between steep ridgelines, some of them rising 1,000 feet or more above the valley floors. The forest cover is dense: oak, hickory, poplar, hemlock in the deeper hollows. Visibility drops to almost nothing once you step off a road or a cleared field. The old strip mines add another layer. When the coal companies pulled out in the 70s and 80s, they left behind networks of haul roads, bench cuts, and open pits that have been slowly reclaimed by vegetation. These abandoned mine sites create pockets of habitat that are essentially invisible from any road or trail. You could hide an army in these hollows and nobody would know. Daniel Boone National Forest borders the Witnesses' property to the east. That forest is managed by the U.S. Forest Service and stretches from Moorhead in the north all the way down to the Tennessee line. Within it, you've got the Red River Gorge, the Clifty Wilderness, and hundreds of thousands of acres of backcountry that see almost no human traffic outside of hunting season. The Dogman sighting corridor that researchers have mapped across the eastern United States runs directly through this region, connecting the Great Lakes cluster in Michigan and Wisconsin to the Appalachian cluster in Kentucky, West Virginia, and Western Virginia. This is not a random location. It's a pattern.
When I got back inside that night, I sat down at the kitchen table and I didn't move for hours. I kept the .45 right there in front of me. My wife was asleep and I wasn't about to wake her up and tell her what I'd just seen because I didn't even know what I'd just seen. All I knew was it was big, it was standing up, and it looked right at me like it was deciding something. The way it turned and walked off, it didn't scramble, it didn't bolt, it just turned and walked. Like it wasn't afraid of me at all.
I want to break down what happened that night in more detail because the specifics matter. The Witness's dog was a wolf-malamute hybrid, which is a breed known for being fearless in cold weather, territorial, and not easily spooked. These are dogs that were bred to deal with wolves and bears. The fact that this animal was in a state of complete distress, head down, tail tucked, hackles raised, pacing at the end of a chain it had never pulled against before, tells you something about what was out there. Dogs operate on instinct that predates anything humans can rationalize away. When a wolf-malamute hybrid is terrified, you should be terrified. The Witness grabbed a Colt 45 ACP and a handheld spotlight, which is a standard response for anyone in rural eastern Kentucky when something is wrong on their property at night. Coyotes, black bears, feral dogs, these are real and common threats. He expected to find one of those. What he found was a bipedal figure standing at the edge of his tree line, roughly 60 yards from his back door. The spotlight reflected off the eyes at a height of approximately 7 to 8 feet. The Dogman was standing fully upright with broad shoulders that the Witness described as wider than any man he'd ever seen. The body was dark, the details hard to make out behind the glare of the eyeshine, but the silhouette was unmistakable. This was not a bear on its hind legs. Bears don't stand motionless and stare at a spotlight. Bears don't turn and walk away on two legs with a smooth, deliberate gait. The Dogman didn't react to the spotlight the way any known animal in eastern Kentucky would react. Black bears avoid light. Coyotes scatter. Feral dogs either charge or bolt, depending on their level of aggression. This creature did neither. It stood its ground at the edge of the tree line and watched. The Witness estimated that the stare lasted somewhere between 10 and 20 seconds, though he admits that time felt distorted in the moment. 10 seconds doesn't sound like much until you're standing in your backyard at 1 a.m. with a flashlight on something that shouldn't exist, and it's staring back at you without blinking. I personally think the most important detail in this entire encounter is what the Witness said about the trigger. He was holding a loaded .45, and his finger never touched the trigger. Not because he forgot, because some part of his brain, some deep survival instinct, told him that shooting would only make things worse. That's not a rational decision. That's a prey response. That's your body telling you that you are not the predator in this situation. And the best thing you can do is not escalate. I've heard this same detail from witnesses across Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and now Kentucky. The gun doesn't feel like enough. As I covered in my video about the Lynn County, Iowa deputy who encountered a dogman while on patrol, even a trained law enforcement officer armed with a Glock 40 said the same thing. The firearm didn't feel like enough. The dogman turned and walked into the trees without urgency. The witness described the movement as deliberate and smooth, like a person walking into another room. Not running, not scrambling through brush. Walking, upright, on two legs. The confidence of that exit is consistent with what Linda Godfrey documented in her book Real Wolfmen. These creatures do not flee from humans. They disengage on their own terms, at their own pace, as if they've assessed the situation and decided the encounter is over. The human doesn't get a vote. The witness did not tell anyone what he saw. Not his wife, not his adult children, not his neighbors, not the local sheriff's office, nobody. He went back to work the next day and carried it alone. I've seen this pattern over and over again in the years I've been running this channel. The silence isn't because people don't think what they saw was real. The silence is because they know exactly what they saw, and they know nobody will believe them. In a small rural community where everybody knows everybody, coming forward with a story like this doesn't just risk ridicule. It risks your reputation, your credibility, and in the case of a medical professional, potentially your career. But the dogman didn't leave. Over the next decade, the evidence accumulated on that property in ways that the witness couldn't ignore even though he tried. Chickens started disappearing from the coop. Not the way coyotes take chickens. Coyotes leave feathers, blood, scattered remains, signs of a chaotic attack. These chickens were just gone. No feathers, no blood, no broken wire on the coop. Just empty spaces where birds used to be. The witness reinforced the coop, added better latches, installed motion lights. The disappearances continued. Then the deer carcasses started showing up. He found the first one at the edge of his back field near the same tree line where he'd seen the dogman. It was a mature doe and the body showed no bite marks along the edges. No sign of coyote or bear predation. But the midsection was crushed. The ribs were broken inward as if something had wrapped around the body and squeezed. The witness had seen enough trauma in 36 years of medical work to recognize compression injuries. This was not a vehicle strike. The deer was found well inside his property, far from any road. He found 2 more carcasses over the following years, both showing the same pattern. Crushed midsections, no bite marks, no blood trail. His dogs changed too. The wolf malamute wouldn't go past a certain point near the back tree line after dark. If the witness tried to walk the dog toward that section of the property at night, the animal would plant its feet and refuse. During the day, no problem. After sunset, it was as if an invisible fence had been drawn across the yard. Other dogs on the property exhibited the same behavior. They would bark toward the tree line at night, then go silent all at once, as if whatever they were barking at had gotten close enough to trigger a different response. Not aggression, submission. I've talked about this in previous videos. The moment a dog stops barking and goes quiet is the moment it has decided that the threat is too large to challenge. That transition from alarm to silence is one of the most reliable indicators that something predatory and unfamiliar is present. The witness found tracks multiple times over the years. 5 toed impressions in soft mud along the creek bed that runs through his property. 14 inches long with claw marks extending past the toes. The stride between prints measured roughly 6 feet, indicating a bipedal gait. He photographed the tracks but showed the photos to no one. He measured them, noted them, and filed the information away the same way he'd file a patient chart, carefully, accurately, and without emotion. It was his way of coping. If he treated it like data, he didn't have to treat it like a monster living on his property. There were sounds too. On multiple occasions over the years, the witness heard something he couldn't explain coming from the direction of the tree line at night. Not howling, not barking. He described it as a low, guttural vocalization that carried across the open ground between the house and the trees. It wasn't continuous. It would come in short bursts, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, then silence, then another burst. from a slightly different position along the tree line, as if whatever was producing the sound was moving while it called. He said it was deeper than any sound he'd heard from a coyote or a dog, with a resonance that he could feel in his chest as much as hear with his ears. On one occasion, the sound was answered from somewhere farther off, deeper in the forest, which suggests more than one animal. That possibility, that there isn't just one Dogman but a population, is something he said he tries not to think about. The witness also described 2 occasions where he found damage to structures on his property that he couldn't attribute to any normal cause. A heavy wooden gate at the back of his barn was found ripped off its top hinge, the metal bracket bent outward as if something had pulled the gate open with significant force from the wrong side. The gate weighed over 100 pounds. A bear could potentially do that damage, but there were no claw marks on the wood, no bear hair caught in the splinters, and no bear tracks in the soft ground nearby. The second incident involved a section of fence at the back of the property that was pushed flat, not knocked over by wind or weight from above, but pushed straight down as if something had stepped on the top rail and pressed it into the ground. The fence posts were intact. The rails were bent flat. He repaired it twice, and both times it happened again within weeks. I personally find this decade of silence the most disturbing part of the entire story. Not the initial sighting, not the crushed deer, the silence. This man reorganized his entire life around a presence he couldn't explain and refused to discuss. He stopped walking his back fields at dusk. He stopped fishing his pond in the evening. He made sure his grandchildren were inside before dark, and he made sure every exterior light on the property was working at all times. He built his life around the Dogman's schedule without ever saying its name out loud. 20 years of quiet accommodation with something that should not exist.
My grandson and I were fishing at the pond. He's maybe 12 at the time. It was afternoon, still light out. He's fishing off the far side near where the windmill goes down into the pond. I'm on the near side, reeling real slow to keep from snagging the aeration line. Next thing I know, he throws his pole down and comes running around toward me. And his eyes were the size of $50. He's going, "Did you see it? Did you see it?" And I said, "See what?" And he said, "I saw it. It was big and it was so fast." I asked him, "Was it a deer?" He said it wasn't a deer. I asked, "How did it run?" He said it wasn't running standing up, and it wasn't running on all fours. It was kind of hunched over. And then it stopped at the tree line. Just stopped and stood there.
The witness walked his grandson back to the car and told the boy to stay there. Then he walked alone toward the tree line where his grandson had pointed. The entry point was a narrow cut where the tree canopy jagged back from the field edge, creating a shadowed gap. He stepped to the edge of the trees and looked in. 5 to 7 yards inside the tree line, for just an instant, he saw something looking back at him from beside a tree trunk, a shape partially obscured watching him. He blinked and it was gone. No sound of movement through the brush, no cracking branches, no retreating footsteps. Just there, then not there. The Dogman had been watching them fish. The witness did not have a firearm with him that day. He made a decision in that moment that the smart play was to leave. He walked back to the car, drove his grandson home, and said nothing about what he'd seen in the trees. But the grandson was shaken. The boy came through the front door telling his grandmother what he'd seen. She looked at the witness. He looked back. He said to her, "It's there. He saw what you think he saw." That was the first time he acknowledged it out loud to anyone in his family. 14 years of silence, broken by a 12-year-old who stumbled into the truth by accident. What hits me about this encounter is the independent corroboration. The grandson had never been told about the 2004 sighting. He had never been told about the tracks, the dead deer, the dogs refusing to go past the tree line. He described a large bipedal creature that moved in a hunched posture between bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion, fast enough to cross 2 open fields in seconds. That description is textbook Dogman behavior as catalogued by researchers at the North American Dogman Project, which was founded by Jody Cook out of Ohio and maintains a dedicated Kentucky chapter tracking reports across the eastern part of the state. The NADP has logged dozens of reports from this exact geographic corridor, the transition zone where the Daniel Boone National Forest meets private agricultural land in Perry, Knott, Letcher, and Pike counties. The creature the grandson described also matches the behavioral profile in an important way. It was active in daylight. Most Dogman encounters are nocturnal, but a significant percentage of reports describe daytime sightings, particularly in remote areas with low human traffic. The NADP's database shows that roughly 15 to 20% of credible Dogman encounters occur during daylight hours, with the highest concentration in late afternoon when shadows lengthen and the transition between day and night begins. The witness and his grandson were at the pond in the afternoon, well before dusk. That tells me the Dogman was either already in the area or had moved into position deliberately while the two of them were fishing. Either way, it was aware of their presence before they were aware of its presence. The Dogman didn't flee when the boy saw it. It ran to the tree line and stopped. It held its position. It watched. That's territorial behavior. That's an animal that considers this area its range and tolerates the humans within it as long as they don't cross a boundary. I've talked about this in previous videos on trail stories. The idea that Dogman encounters cluster on properties that border large tracts of wilderness because the creatures use those wilderness areas as primary habitat and the agricultural fringe as a hunting buffer. This property fits that pattern exactly.
That's when I knew it wasn't just me. That's when I knew it was still there. After all those years. And my grandson, he didn't go back down to the creek or the pond the rest of that year. Wouldn't do it. Didn't like being outside after that. When my grandkids wanted to play outside at night, I'd tell them no. Just cut your grandpa some slack and stay inside after dark. I couldn't tell them why, but I wasn't going to let them be out there.
15 miles from that property in the Emelina community of Knott County, something happened on February 18, 2020 that the authorities have never fully explained to my satisfaction. A 13-year-old boy named Corey Godsey was found dead on a mountainside behind a residence on Montgomery Creek Road. His body was discovered approximately 1,500 feet up a steep wooded hillside. Kentucky State Police Post 13 in Hazard received the call shortly after 6 in the evening. The initial report described a canine-type animal attack. Personnel from KSP, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Knott County Sheriff's Office, Lifeguard Ambulance, and Ball Creek Fire and Rescue all responded to the scene. The Knott County coroner, Corey Watson, pronounced the boy dead at the scene from injuries associated with an animal attack. An autopsy at the State Medical Examiner's office in Frankfort confirmed the cause of death, but could not determine what type of animal was responsible. Let me say that again. The State Medical Examiner confirmed it was an animal attack, but could not identify the animal. KSP Trooper Jody Sims told reporters that people in the area should remain hypervigilant, especially at night. He urged residents to be very cognizant of their surroundings and careful about what they had around their homes. 6 months later, in August of 2020, KSP announced that they had determined the cause of death. Using wildlife cameras and equipment, investigators located multiple dogs living on an old mine site near the area where the body was found. The dogs were transported to the Kentucky River Animal Shelter in Hazard, where DNA specimens were collected and compared to evidence found on the victim. KSP stated that lab comparisons indicated specimens from several of the dogs matched those found on Corey. Case closed. I personally think there are questions here that deserve more attention than they've received. A 13-year-old boy was found 1,500 feet up a steep mountainside. That's a significant distance and a significant climb. How did the encounter begin? Was the boy being pursued uphill? Were the dogs, if it was dogs, chasing him away from the residence and up the mountain? The terrain in that area is steep enough that first responders had difficulty reaching the body in the dark. Rain and poor visibility complicated the recovery. KSP acknowledged that it was an extremely difficult scene, and initially, the medical examiner could not identify the species responsible. It took 6 months to match DNA to dogs at an abandoned mine site. In the meantime, the community was told to remain hyper-vigilant, especially at night. A lot of you asked about this case after my last video on Appalachian encounters, and I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying feral dogs couldn't have been responsible. Feral dog packs are a real problem in rural eastern Kentucky, particularly around abandoned mine sites where they establish territory away from human populations. What I am saying is that the initial ambiguity, the medical examiner's inability to identify the animal, the warning to remain hypervigilant at night, the 6-month gap between the death and the official determination, creates a space where other possibilities exist. And the fact that this happened in the same geographic corridor where our witness has been documenting Dogman activity for 20 years is not something I'm willing to dismiss as coincidence. The abandoned mine sites are the key. They connect everything. The dogs in the Godsey case were found living on an old mine site. The witness's property borders old strip mine land. These mine sites create networks of cleared ground, regrown forest, old haul roads, and open pits that are essentially unmonitored wilderness within sight of people's homes. Whatever is using that terrain, whether it's feral dog packs or something else entirely, has access to habitat that nobody is watching. Shane Everidge, a resident who lived less than a mile from where Corey Godsey was found, told reporters that his family had lived on Montgomery Creek Road for more than 30 years. He said they'd heard of coyotes and wild hogs being in the area, but nothing like what happened to that boy. He said his family had occasionally noticed chickens going missing, but never thought much of it. That detail stopped me cold when I read it, because it's the exact same pattern our witness described on his property 15 miles away. Chickens disappearing without the usual signs of predation. Livestock gone without explanation. The same behavior, the same geography, the same type of terrain bordering the same national forest. The Emelena community itself is exactly the kind of place where something like a dogman could operate without detection. It sits in a narrow hollow surrounded by steep forested ridges. The population is sparse. The roads are narrow and poorly maintained. The nearest significant town is Hazard, about 20 minutes away. Strip mine sites dot the surrounding hills, and the forest has been slowly reclaiming them for decades. The ridgeline above Montgomery Creek Road connects directly to the backcountry of Daniel Boone National Forest through a series of old haul roads and logging cuts that haven't been maintained in years. For a large predator capable of traveling on 2 legs through dense forest, this terrain is a highway. Eastern Kentucky sits at the intersection of what were historically Cherokee and Shawnee territories. Both nations maintained oral traditions involving beings that don't fit neatly into the categories of animals we consider normal. The Shawnee spoke of shape-shifting figures associated with deep forest and places where the natural order felt wrong, places where birds went silent and dogs refused to go. These weren't campfire ghost stories. They were practical behavioral warnings encoded in oral tradition. Don't travel certain ridgelines at night. Don't camp near certain water sources. Leave markers at boundary points and respect what's on the other side. The Cherokee tradition includes accounts of the Ewa, a massive creature sometimes described as a great bear, and sometimes described as something more canine, associated with aggression, territorial behavior, and overwhelming physical power. There's also the broader Appalachian tradition of what the old-timers call haints and boogers, a catch-all category for things seen in the woods that don't have names in English. When you talk to families who have been in these hollows for generations, you hear the same warning repeated in different words. Stay out of certain places after dark. Don't go past the ridgeline. Don't follow sounds you can't identify. The language changes, but the behavioral instruction is identical, and it maps directly onto the geographic zones where modern dogman encounters are being reported. As I covered in my video on ancient native knowledge of the dogman, these indigenous communities weren't operating on superstition. They were operating on generations of empirical observation. They mapped the behavior of these creatures the way modern wildlife biologists map bear or wolf activity. Through observation, documentation, and the transmission of survival-critical information from one generation to the next, We stopped listening to that data when European settlers decided that anything not in a textbook wasn't real. But the creatures didn't stop being real just because we stopped believing in them. The Appalachian oral tradition adds another layer. Families who have been in eastern Kentucky since the 1800s have their own body of encounter stories that predate any internet forum or YouTube channel. These families settled in the same hollows where their descendants live today, and they pass down warnings through generations that have an eerie specificity to them. Don't build near certain creek beds. Don't hunt on certain ridgelines after November. If your livestock starts acting strange at night, bring them in close and don't go looking for what spooked them. These aren't vague superstitions. They're instructions tied to specific geographic features and specific times of year, and they align almost perfectly with the seasonal and geographic patterns that modern Dogman researchers have documented independently. Linda Godfrey, who broke the Beast of Bray Road story in Wisconsin in 1991 and spent decades investigating Dogman encounters across the country, has documented reports from Appalachia that share the same behavioral signature as Great Lakes reports: nocturnal, territorial, associated with waterways and old-growth forest, and displaying an intelligence that goes beyond what we'd expect from any known predator. Godfrey's work, along with the ongoing research of the North American Dogman Project and its Kentucky chapter, has established that this corridor from the Great Lakes through Ohio and into Appalachia represents one of the densest clusters of Dogman activity in North America. The creature doesn't respect state lines. It follows terrain. It follows watersheds and ridgelines and forest corridors that have been there since before humans drew borders on maps.
My wife saw it too, maybe 3 years ago. She was up late, I was already in bed, and she was sitting in the front room with the lights off, watching television. She saw something cross the yard, big, upright, moving from the tree line toward the barn and then back again. She came to bed and didn't say anything. She didn't tell me for 2 days. And when she did, she said, "I always thought you were seeing things, but I'm not so sure anymore." She was shaking when she told me. Shaking. This is a strong woman. She's buried family, she's raised kids, and she was shaking telling me about what walked across our yard. My son saw something near the pond too. He won't talk about it, but I know what he saw from the look on his face when he came back to the house. He was white as a sheet, and he didn't go back out there that day. That's 3 generations now. Me, my wife, my son, my grandson, all on the same property, same tree line, same creature, and it's still there. I can't prove it to anybody, but I know it's there.
3 generations of the same family on the same property, describing the same creature across a span of 20 years. None of them shared their experiences with each other until after the fact. The witness didn't tell his wife until she saw it herself. The grandson wasn't told about the 2004 sighting before his own encounter in 2018. The son has never spoken about what he saw in detail. The wife kept her sighting to herself for 2 days before she could bring herself to say it out loud. Each family member arrived at the same conclusion independently, through their own direct observation, with no prior contamination of their perception. That's not mass hysteria. That's not a shared delusion fed by scary stories around the dinner table. That's consistent, independent observation of a recurring phenomenon on a fixed geographic location. In any other field of study, that pattern would be considered strong preliminary evidence worth investigating further. The witness still lives on that property. He has no plans to leave. His family has been on that land for generations, and a dogman isn't going to be the thing that drives them off. But it has changed him. He doesn't walk the back fields after dark. He doesn't fish the pond at dusk anymore. He keeps loaded firearms accessible throughout the house, and he has installed additional exterior lighting on every side of the property. He watches the tree line from his kitchen window at night with the interior lights off so his reflection won't block the view. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, he sees movement at the edge where the cleared ground meets the forest. A shape that shouldn't be there. A shadow that moves against the direction of the wind. Eyes that catch the light from the barn and hold it for a moment before disappearing.
People ask me why I don't just leave. Where am I going to go? This is my land, my family's land. I'm not leaving because something lives in those trees that I can't explain. But I'll tell you what I tell my grandkids. You don't go out there after dark. You don't walk to the tree line by yourself. And if the dogs go quiet, you get inside and you lock the door. That's how we live now. That's how we've lived for 20 years.
This is not one man's story. When you start mapping Dogman encounters in eastern Kentucky against the geography, a pattern emerges that is difficult to dismiss. The NADP Kentucky chapter has logged multiple reports from Perry, Knott, Letcher, and Pike counties, all clustered along the western boundary of Daniel Boone National Forest, where private land meets federally managed wilderness. The encounters share behavioral markers that are consistent across reports separated by years and by miles. Nocturnal activity predominating. Territorial behavior centered on specific properties. Dogs exhibiting extreme fear responses. Livestock disappearing without typical predation evidence. And witnesses who stay silent for years before coming forward. The geography enables it. Daniel Boone National Forest is not a manicured park. Large sections of it are roadless backcountry, with terrain so steep and vegetation so dense that ground searches are essentially impossible. The Red River Gorge alone contains over 29,000 acres of rugged cliff terrain, box canyons and old-growth forest that has never been fully surveyed. The Clifty Wilderness adds another 13,000 acres of federally protected land, where mechanized equipment and motorized vehicles are prohibited, meaning that even the Forest Service has limited ability to monitor what lives there. Beyond these designated areas, the forest contains hundreds of thousands of additional acres of backcountry where the only access is on foot, and most of it hasn't been walked by a human being in years. The abandoned mine sites that border the forest add thousands of additional acres of unmonitored habitat. The old haul roads provide travel corridors that connect deep forest to the agricultural fringe where people live. A large, intelligent predator could use these corridors to move between wilderness habitat and the edges of human settlement without ever being seen on a road or captured on a standard security camera. The infrastructure for concealment already exists. The coal companies built it and then walked away. I want to mention something else that stuck with me while researching this story. Kentucky has a remarkably high number of missing persons cases for its population size. The Kentucky State Police maintain an active missing persons list, and organizations like Unsolved Appalachia have been working to document cases that have gone cold across the eastern part of the state. Not all of these cases have anything to do with what we're discussing. People go missing in these mountains for all kinds of reasons: accidents, exposure, foul play, voluntary disappearance. But there's a concentration of unexplained cases in the counties bordering Daniel Boone National Forest that has never been adequately studied. Cases where people left home on foot and were never found. Cases where remains were discovered in locations that didn't make sense given the person's last known position. Cases where search teams covered every logical route and found nothing. The terrain swallows people. The question is whether the terrain is the only thing doing the swallowing. I spent weeks pulling this story together, and I've been thinking about it non-stop since the witness first reached out. I've been running trail stories long enough to know that not every story checks out. Some people misidentify bears, some people exaggerate, some people fabricate. But this one is different. The witness is credible, a medical professional with decades of clinical experience and no motive to lie. The encounters span 20 years. And 3 family members who arrived at the same observations independently. The geographic profile matches known hotspot patterns identified by the NADP and corroborated by Godfrey's decades of field research. And 15 miles away, A boy died on a mountainside under circumstances that authorities initially couldn't explain, and then spent 6 months officially resolving. I'm not telling you what to believe. I never do that on this channel. What I do is lay out the evidence, the testimony, and the patterns, and I let you decide. But I'll tell you what I personally believe. I believe that man saw exactly what he says he saw. I believe his grandson saw it. I believe his wife and his son saw it. I believe something has been living in those trees at the edge of his property for at least 20 years, something that doesn't appear in any field guide, something that the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife has no category for and no interest in investigating. And I believe that until we start taking these reports seriously, not as folklore, not as misidentification, not as entertainment, but as data, we will keep losing the chance to understand what is sharing this landscape with us. The witness asked me to say one more thing. He said he doesn't want anyone to come looking for this creature on his property. He doesn't want researchers showing up with cameras and thermal imaging equipment. He doesn't want hunters deciding they're going to bag the thing. He wants people to know it's real, and he wants people to be careful. That's it. He's lived alongside this Dogman for 20 years and his family is still alive. He attributes that to one simple rule: respect the boundary. Don't go past the tree line after dark. Let whatever's out there keep its distance, and you keep yours. I think that's wisdom worth listening to. The old-timers in these hollows have been saying the same thing for generations. The Cherokee said it, the Shawnee said it, the families who've been on this land for 200 years say it. Stay out of certain places after dark. Respect the markers. And if the dogs go quiet, get inside. I've been obsessed with this case since the witness first reached out, and I keep coming back to the same thought. We live in a country that spent billions of dollars mapping the surface of Mars, but has never conducted a systematic survey of what lives in the backcountry of its own national forests. The Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife has no formal protocol for investigating cryptid reports. When witnesses call in what they've seen, the reports go nowhere. There is no tracking system. There is no follow-up. There is no pattern analysis. The data is lost before it can be collected. Until that changes, until someone with the authority and the resources decides to take this seriously, we're going to keep relying on witnesses like this man, terminally ill, sitting on his porch in rural Kentucky, telling his story to a YouTube channel because he's got nowhere else to go with it. That should bother all of us. For more stories like this, consider subscribing.